By 1944, it was common knowledge that the invasion by Western Allied troops would take place somewhere along the coast of France or Belgium. After all, it hadn't escaped Germany's notice that at the Tehran Conference from November 28 to December 1943, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in blue, and Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in green, had promised their Soviet ally against Germany, the dictator Joseph Stalin, in red, to relieve the Red Army with the so-called Second Front. For this, extensive planning for the operation had been carried out in the USA and Great Britain. Operation Overlord, which on June 1944 led to the Allied landing in Normandy. A part of Overlord was Operation Neptune, the direct assault on the German fortifications in Normandy and the establishment of a bridgehead. To defend against the invasion, the so-called Atlantic Wall had been planned and partially constructed on the German side, a defensive line equipped with all kinds of obstacles, gun bunkers, and fortified Atlantic Wall positions stretching over 2,685 kilometers from Norway down to the French-Portuguese border. However, the Atlantic Wall, especially in the Normandy area on the northern coast of France, was more of a propaganda product shown in the German newsreels than a completed defense system. After all, the High Command of the Wehrmacht, OKW, had stationed 2 German armies from Normandy in red to Pas-de-Calais in blue, dividing this area between them. The 7th Army of Colonel General Friedrich Dollmann, which was stationed along the Breton coast up to the mouth of the Seine, and the 15th Army of General von Salmuth, which was stationed from Le Havre to the northwest. The German naval forces stationed along the coast, with headquarters in Roche, were commanded by Admiral Proglasser, Army of Friedrich Dollmann, which was stationed along the Seine. From January 1944, he was in command of 2 sectors, the one in the west stretching from the Bay of Mont-Saint-Michel to the mouth of the Orne. The one under Admiral Walter Hennig, who was based in Cherbourg, was Dollmann's coast, and in the east, the area stretching from the mouth of the Orne to the Somme, under Rear Admiral Henning von Presco, who was based in Le Havre. However, the German Navy, already severely weakened by the previous years of war, only had 163 minesweepers left, R-boats, 57 patrol boats, 42 so-called artillery carriers, 34 S-boats, and 5 torpedo boats. The Air Force units of the 3rd Air Fleet designated for invasion defense were under the command of Field Marshal Hugo Spurley. However, for the surveillance of the entire French airspace, he had only 971 aircraft at his disposal. When it mattered, they had not been able to use their airfields along the Channel coast due to the relentless heavy air attacks by the vastly superior Allied air forces. Thus, at the start of the invasion, only the squadrons of the 1st Group of Fighter Wing 2 Richthofen, as well as the 1st and 3rd Groups of Fighter Wing 26 Schlageter and their staffs, were available. Then, starting at 4:30 a.m. on the 6th, June 1944, a Tuesday, the invasion of the Allied forces in Normandy began, carried out with an overwhelming superiority of warships and aircraft. This attack caught the German leadership completely by surprise. Later, General of the Artillery Walter Warlimont wrote, on the 5th, on June 5, 1944, the eve of the invasion, the German headquarters was not in the least aware that the decisive event, the event of the war, was about to happen. No reconnaissance had detected the more than 5,000 ships. It was actually 6,939 including 1,213 warships that had been moving across the channel toward the coast of Normandy for the past 24 hours. No situation assessment, whether by Rommel, Rundstedt, or the Wehrmacht command staff, took the weather into account. There were no signs that a landing was even considered likely in the near future. In addition, the idea had taken hold in the minds of the top military leadership that the Allied landing would not take place on the stretch of French coast farthest from Great Britain, but rather in the area of the 15th Army, opposite Dover, in the Pas-de-Calais, and probably only in calm weather. Since now the German Weather Service and Major Littau predicted for the days of June 5th, since stormy weather over the Channel had been forecast around June 5th, here is the Allied weather map for that. Part of the troops were moved inland for exercises. Officers were not with their staffs or had been ordered to a so-called war game at Rennes. And the Army Group Commander, General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had traveled to his hometown of Herrlingen for his wife's 50th birthday. However, as the German intelligence service had already known for some time, the invasion was to be announced to the French resistance by 2 radio messages broadcast by the BBC in London. Then, on June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, the radio intelligence intercepted the first part. The line from the autumn poem by the French poet Paul Verlaine. The long sobs of the violins of autumn. With that, the Counterintelligence Division at the OKW realized that the invasion was now imminent. They were now waiting for the crucial second message. My heart is filled with a monotonous melancholy, which would announce the invasion within the next 48 hours. In fact, the BBC broadcast this sentence on June 5th at 9:15 p.m., and it was also picked up by the German Radio Monitoring Service. The unfortunately blurry page shown here comes from the War Diary of the High Command of the 15th Army and documents the reception of the second part of the Verlaine poem, as well as the correct interpretation of this message. The invasion is expected to begin within 48 hours from June 6th. As a result, the 15th Army stationed in Pas-de-Calais was put on alert. However, the 7th Army stationed in Normandy was not notified. Why this happened is still unclear to this day. Many reasons have been cited for this, ranging from too many false alarms in the past to deliberately not sounding the alarm. Now, if we take a look at the German army units in Normandy, which were under the command of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief West, stationed in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The next lower level was Army Group B in La Roche-Guyon under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Army Group B included the 7th and 15th Armies, Army, the Wehrmacht commander in the Netherlands, as well as Panzer Group West. However, during the invasion, it was mainly the 7th Army, under Colonel General Friedrich Dollmann, who was based in Le Mans, had to bear the main burden of the fighting from the very first minute. So this consideration will focus mainly on this large unit. But if you take a closer look at the seemingly impressive 7th Army, you quickly become disillusioned. Because the majority of these divisions were so-called static divisions with few vehicles, and were made up of older soldiers or those wounded in the east, but still considered fit for war service. There were even battalions of soldiers with stomach or ear ailments. In addition, there was a considerable number of so-called Eastern battalions, which were made up of former Soviet prisoners of war, the so-called Hiwis. Their willingness to fight ranged from 1/3 were good, 1/3 average, and 1/3 poor. The 7th Army was organized into the 25th Corps, led by General of Artillery Wilhelm Farnbacher, and stationed in Pont-de-Vie. Army Corps, with the 265th stationed in Cap Quimper in Brittany, and equipped with captured Russian weapons. Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Walter Duevert, which included, among others, a North Caucasian and an Eastern battalion, and was mostly encircled in Saint-Nazaire during the invasion battles. The 275th, stationed in Reading and formed in 1943 mainly with recruits and so-called combed-out soldiers without previous frontline experience. 75. Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Hans Schmidt, which, due to many persistent problems with equipment and training, was still not fully ready for the front even after 6 months. During the invasion battles, the division suffered heavy losses, and only small parts were able to break out and fight their way back across the Seine and Somme to southern Belgium. The 343rd Infantry Division in Lauternon under Lieutenant General Erwin Rauch. It was destroyed on September 19, 1944, during the fall of the fortress of Brest in France. And the 353rd Infantry Division in Hulgod under Lieutenant General Paul Malman. It had been so decimated in the so-called Verlaise pocket that it had to be reformed in Germany in November. Furthermore, the 7th Army was divided into the 74th Army Corps under General of the Infantry Erich Straube, with the 77th, which was stationed in the Dinant area and formed in January 1944. Infantry Division under the command of Lieutenant General Rudolf Stegmann, who was killed near Breibeck in June 1944, then led by Colonel of the Reserve Rudolf Backerer. The 77th was encircled at Saint-Malo and was destroyed on August 15th. And the 266th, which was stationed in Belle-Île-en-Terre, Infantry Division and Lieutenant General Karl Spang, who had already been destroyed at Saint-Malo in July. The 3rd Corps, subordinated to the 7th Army, was the 84th, stationed in Saint-Malo, and was under the command of General of Artillery Erich Marx, who was killed in a low-flying attack on June 12 with the 91st Airborne Infantry Division stationed in Eau-de-Bernville. This division, established in 1944 under the command of Lieutenant General Wilhelm Falle, was stationed on the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy and had been held as a corps reserve inland on the peninsula. When the 82nd and the 101st landed on June 6th, U.S. airborne divisions were dropped. Their landing zones were right in the accommodation and assembly areas of the division. Because of this fragmentation of the German regiments, a coordinated counterattack had become significantly more difficult. In the early hours, as Lieutenant General Wilhelm Falle was returning from the cancelled war game in Rennes to his command post in Pont-l'Abbé, he and Major Joachim Batuzat were ambushed by paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division and were killed in an ambush. Temporarily, Colonel Bernhard Klosterkemper, commander of the Canadian Grenadier Regiment 920 in the 243rd, took command of the division. 4 days later, Colonel Koenig took command of the division, who had previously been the commander of the Grenadier Regiment 1057 of the division. The losses of the shattered 91st. By the 4th day, the losses of the 91st Airborne Infantry Division already amounted to almost a third of its strength. As the fighting continued, the 91st E was reduced to just a battle group made up of the remnants of the division. It was then assigned to reinforce various other infantry divisions. After further heavy losses, the division was disbanded on August 10th, the 243rd Infantry Division under the command, as of the 17th, Lieutenant General Heinz Helmich, who was killed on June 17th in Château de Malassy, which was then led by Major General Bernhard Klosterkemper. The 243rd was positioned in the western coastal area of the Cotentin Peninsula, but was quickly pushed back and severely decimated in the course of the fighting. The 319th Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Count Rudolf von Schmettow which was stationed as an occupying force on the Channel Islands of Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney, and Sark in the English Channel. The 352nd Infantry Division in Litry, under the command of Lieutenant General Dietrich Kreis, who was killed near St. Lo on August 6, 1944, which, being directly on the coast in the Allied landing sectors Omaha Beach and Gold Beach, suffered such heavy losses from naval artillery and close infantry combat that it had to be disbanded at the end of July. This division also played a role in the 1962 Hollywood film about the first day of the invasion, The Longest Day. Those of you who know the impressive film with 50 stars may remember the scene with Hans Christian Bleck as Major Werner Pluskart, commander of the 1st E Battalion of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, when on the morning of June 6th, he supposedly was the first German officer to spot the Allied landing ships. However, this scene is not historically accurate because Pluskart was on June 6th. He was neither at the artillery staff nor at his coastal observation bunker in Resistance Nest 59, nor in his quarters. On the contrary, he was in the rear area with gentlemen from his staff in the company of 4 women from a military theater troupe, even though they knew that the invasion was imminent. The film also briefly shows the scene in which the 21-year-old Gefreiter Heinrich Sewerloh from Major Pluskart's unit, subordinate to the 3rd Battery of Artillery Regiment, 352, as a machine gunner from this position in Resistance Nest. 62 had killed or wounded numerous U.S. soldiers with his MG-42. Here is the view towards the Omaha Beach sector. Sewerloh had fired until he ran out of ammunition and was taken prisoner. After the war, he reported on his commander. In a long speech on June 2, 1944, Pluskart let us know in a veiled way that we should withdraw as quickly as possible after the attack began. And furthermore, on the day of the invasion, Pluskart was never with his unit. During the 6th, on June 6th, 1st Lieutenant Feuchtinger made numerous attempts to reach him by phone, but our battalion commander was nowhere to be found. There was also the 709th Étourthide Infantry Division in Château de Chivras, which had an average age of 36 years, led by Lieutenant General Wilhelm von Schlieben. The 709th was also positioned at the Omaha Beach landing zone and was heavily decimated. The 716th in Fliers-Couvrec and Lieutenant General Wilhelm Richter, here still as a colonel. 40 in it were Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans with little knowledge of German, which made leadership more difficult. After heavy losses against British and Canadian units, it had to be withdrawn from the main line of battle, and the 30th Fast Brigade, which had been taken over from the reserves under the command as of the 18th, Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Ernst von Offses, who was killed near St. Lo on July 18, 1944, and which mainly consisted of bicycle battalions and an artillery battalion with 12 12.2 Seentracht guns. It was located west of St. Lo and was destroyed in July. Finally, the 7th was under its command. The Army also included the 2nd Parachute Corps, stationed in Quentin, and commanded by General of Paratroopers Eugen Meindl with the 2nd Paratrooper Division and General of Paratroopers Hermann Donat Bernhard, here during his capture by U.S. troops in September 1944. Their 6th Unit, 3,457 men strong. The regiment under Major von der Heide, who later became a reserve brigadier general in the Bundeswehr, fought fierce battles on the Cotentin Peninsula, including near St. Lo with the 101st. Had fought against the U.S. 101st Airborne Division and, after heavy losses, had to be withdrawn for replenishment on August 10th. The 3rd Paratrooper Division, under Lieutenant General Richard Schimpf in St. Lo, which on the 7th June had been moved from the Brest area to the invasion front. It fought, among others, together with the 17th SS Panzergrenadierdivision Götz von Berlichingen in the area of Saint-Lô, later in the so-called Falaise Pocket. During the breakout between Chambois and Argenton, it was almost completely wiped out. And the 5th Paratrooper Division in Rennes, under Lieutenant General Gustave Wilke, which was largely destroyed in the heavy defensive battles at Saint-Lô and Array by the end of July. The remaining remnants were encircled in the so-called Falaise Pocket. Since the early hours of June 6, the bulk of the major units of the 7th Army had been engaged in combat with the Allied landing troops with varying intensity. However, at no point had it been possible to effectively interrupt the continuous flow of landings, including tanks and artillery, so that by evening, the Allies were able to establish themselves with about 155,000 men in their 5 landing zones. In addition, with tens of thousands of aircraft, they had absolute air superiority. Against the well-equipped Allied divisions, the only partially motorized, sometimes outdated and poorly equipped German divisions had hardly any chance, especially since the bomber streams kept them under fire around the clock and only allowed tactical movements at night. Unfortunately, however, these Allied bombardments, which were supposed to serve the liberation of France from German occupation, killed between 13,600 and 19,800 French civilians even before the invasion. 1,000 more had been seriously injured. Another 800 were killed within 2 days of the invasion. Numerous inhabited cities such as Le Mans, Rennes, Saint-Laurent, Flers, and Le Havre were virtually leveled. There are international historians who consider the order of British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to bomb Caen, a city with 60,000 inhabitants, as tactically unnecessary and as a war crime. The bombardments and shelling of Caen from the air and from the sea had destroyed almost 3/4 of the city, a scale comparable to the most devastated cities. In the end, the bombardment is estimated to have claimed more than 3,000 civilian victims and made 35,000 residents homeless, even severely hindered the advance of the Allies. In total, around 70,000 French civilians were killed in Allied attacks over the course of the war. When the 75th was celebrated in France, when the anniversary of the liberation from German occupation was celebrated, the civilian victims, if they were mentioned at all, were most often referred to as so-called collateral damage. Back to June 1944. The deployment of the powerful reserve of Army Group B in the Normandy area, consisting of 3 tank divisions, could only take place with the authorization of the Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht himself. However, the Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, after receiving various disturbing reports from the coast, had already, at around 4:30 a.m., proactively ordered the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and the Panzer Lehr Division to Saint-Sever-Calvados, south of Saint-Lô. This order was revoked after 2 hours by Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, because these divisions were OKW reserves and needed the Führer's explicit order to be released. Because these divisions were reserves and could not be released without the explicit order of the leader, however, was still asleep. And even a German Colonel General did not dare to wake him up, despite the dramatic situation in the war. Or as Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff and Colonel General, to do what was constantly demanded of that officer or non-commissioned officer at the front, to always adapt to the situation and act independently. The only German modernized combat unit in the Allied landing area was the 21st Panzer Division. Its commander since August 1943 was Major General Edgar Feuchtinger, an officer with a poor reputation among both his subordinates and superiors. Feuchtinger was a show-off and a bluffer, who spent more time in Paris with his South American lover, a so-called actress from Hamburg. Even on the day of the invasion, on June 6th, Feuchtinger had been with her in Paris. When he finally arrived at his command post in the afternoon, exhausted from erotic activities, he had his mistress in tow. Led more by the regimental commanders than by the former artilleryman Feuchtinger, the division suffered heavy losses in men and equipment in the Caen area. Nevertheless, due to boastful reports of success sent to Berlin on the 1st August 1944, he was promoted to lieutenant general and on August 6 awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. In August, a large part of his division was encircled and destroyed in the Falaise pocket. In addition to this ornament of the German General Staff, it can also be stated that while his newly formed division was engaged in heavy fighting in Lower Alsace in January 1945, he was hanging around in Zell, where he arranged a well-provided accommodation for his lover in a manor house, and had basically assigned her 3 subordinates as servants. After the outraged population reported this behavior, Feuchtinger was on the 5th January 1945, arrested and by the Reich Military Court for, quote, enrichment from Jewish property, through the illegal sale of furs, removing subordinates from military service, misappropriation of Wehrmacht property, and sharing military secrets with his South American lover. In the verdict of the 19th, sentenced to death on March 19, 1945, and demoted to gunner. All his medals and honors had also been revoked. Then pardoned by Hitler for frontline service, Feuchtinger was supposed to join the 20th. He was supposed to report to the 20th Panzer Division in Seelow, but instead he went into hiding in Celle and, on the 29th of May 1945, he surrendered to the British in full uniform. After the war, he presented himself in the Federal Republic as a victim of Nazi justice, and from then on received the general's pension. A little later, he was then recruited as a spy by the Soviet Military Intelligence Service GRU, and over the next 7 years, he provided about 1,000 times highly sensitive material about NATO and the planned buildup of the Bundeswehr, which had been in preparation since 1950. When he traveled to Berlin again in January 1960 for another meeting with his Soviet handler, he suffered a stroke on the train and ended on the 21st of the month. He ended his traitorous activities forever. While on July 6, 1944, at least the Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, here on the left with Field Marshal Rommel, was convinced that the invasion had begun. He was still not sure whether the main attack would not take place in the Pas-de-Calais after all. Therefore, he had only moved part of the 7th Army's forces into the attack area in the Calvados Department. When the OKW finally assigned Panzer Group West and General of the Armored Troops, Leo Freier Geyer von Schweppenberg from the 3rd. When General of the Armored Troops Heinrich Eberbach was released in July, their advance had stalled in the rubble of the destroyed villages, and they became easy prey for fighter bombers, anti-tank guns, or bazooka shooters. And since the 15th Army in Pas-de-Calais was supposed to secure the so-called V-weapons deployment and stand ready against a possible further invasion, from the very beginning of the invasion, only the 84th Army Corps of the 7th Army had to act. Army had to bear the main burden of the Allied attacks from the bridgeheads between Caen and Saint-Lô. On June 17, Hitler rejected the joint request of Field Marshals Rundstedt and Rommel to direct the V-weapons against the landing sites, because, as he said, he wanted to hit the enemy's nerve center, London. Promptly, the next day, the first cut off. The U.S. Army under General Omar Bradley cut off Cherbourg with the remnants of 3 to 4 German divisions. Since the beginning of the battle in Normandy, the 7th Army had lost 97,000 men, including 5 generals, as of the 14th. On June 14th, the commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, Brigadeführer Fritz Witt. And now, to prevent any transfer of German reinforcements from the Eastern Front, on the Eastern Front, starting on the 3rd. On the 3rd anniversary of the German invasion, on June 22, 1944, the Soviet Operation Bagration, which led to the complete destruction of Army Group Center. There are 2 videos about this. If you look at the situation with the Western Allies now, they had not managed to do so by the 12th. By June 12th, they had succeeded in connecting the various bridgeheads along a length of about 100 kilometers and a depth of around 30 kilometers inland. In just 7 days, they had landed 326,000 soldiers, 54,000 vehicles, and more than 100,000 tons of war material. However, from then on, the battle in Normandy, crisscrossed with hedges and trenches, broke up into a number of smaller battles, into which all Allied infantry units, supported by artillery, had become bogged down and advanced only very slowly against the stubborn German delaying tactics. On June 28, the commander of the 7th Army, Lieutenant General Dolman, died of a heart attack. Other sources report that he committed suicide by poisoning. On June 29, SS Colonel General Paul Hauser, seen here to the right of Field Marshal Rommel, was appointed the new commander of the 7th Army. Meanwhile, Colonel General Jodl at the Wehrmacht Operations Staff had also realized that the main invasion was taking place in Normandy, and that there would be no further landings, for example in Pas-de-Calais. However, he was unable to convince Hitler and Keitel of his view. As a result, most of the forces of the 15th Army remained in place. The 15th Army remained largely inactive, while the 7th Army, supported by the Panzer Group West, which was renamed Panzer Army 5 on August 5th, stood alone at the invasion front. On July 2nd, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, center of the picture, realized that the destruction of the Allied bridgehead was no longer possible due to the overwhelming material and personnel inferiority of the Wehrmacht and the lack of air superiority. After openly criticizing the top leadership in a conversation with the chief of the High Command of the Wehrmacht, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, during which von Rundstedt had shouted at him, "End the war, you idiots!" On July 2, 1944, he was replaced by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge as Commander-in-Chief West, which, however, did not change the situation. Because more and more, the German units were now being pushed back, which continued until the middle of July. The animation impressively shows how the Allied units kept expanding, capturing city after city, where the Wehrmacht, during their delaying battles, couldn't offer much more than stubborn resistance. Then came the Allied Operation Cobra, the breakout from the Normandy bridgehead and the seizure of open terrain. This Allied plan was based, firstly, on their own material superiority and, secondly, on the realization that the German leadership had not used the 4-week period of static warfare to provide the 7th Army with the necessary reinforcements. Therefore, Cobra stipulated that starting from the 25th July, the 2nd Army shone in green, fighting in the eastern part of the bridgehead. British Army was supposed to tie down or distract the German armored forces, while on the 29th, the 1st U.S. Army, shown in yellow, was to break through the German front in the area of St. Lo, and, in a wide encircling operation, encircled the 7th Army. Previously, on July 18th, the armored divisions of the 8th British Corps attacked south of Caen, where they encountered units of the 21st Panzer Division and the 1st SS Panzer Division LRA. Although the British had been supported by 700 artillery pieces and strong bomber formations, they fell back into their old mistake of doing things by halves instead of going all out. So individual tank battalions fought without support, and one after another, instead of fighting together. After the British Corps had lost around 400 tanks and about 5,500 British and Canadian soldiers, Field Marshal Montgomery ordered the attack to be called off. However, the German command had to use nearly all its reserves to repel the 8th British Corps, pulling strong forces away from the American front and from the Channel coast. Here is the map showing the German positions in red near St. Lo. But that also meant that their own front was relatively weakened right there, just as the Allied High Command had hoped. However, the U.S. attack shown in yellow, which was supposed to take place on July 19th, was postponed because a sudden spell of bad weather hindered the use of Allied air forces. True to the U.S. Army's principle of safety first, they waited for the weather to improve first. Then, on July 25, a heavy airstrike limited to a small area with 1,500 bombers destroyed the already weakened left flank of the German front and enabled the advance of the 1st U.S. Army with 4 armored and 11 infantry divisions to break through to the south. 13 German divisions, which at that point had at most the strength of regimental battle groups, faced them in a hopeless position. The 7th U.S. Corps attacked the position of the 84th with 3 divisions. Army Corps, whose commander, General of Artillery Marks, had fallen in the previous defensive battles, and which was now led by General of Infantry Dietrich von Koltitz. Despite heavy losses, the German units were able to hold the main line of resistance shown in green and the fallback positions with utmost effort for 1 day. But then their strength was exhausted. This made the situation worse on the 26th, and again on July 27th on the 27th. The Allied air units bombarded the already fragmented German positions almost without pause, so that the 7th U.S. Corps was finally able to break through the front along a length of 5 and a depth of 3.5 kilometers. Through this gap, the American tank divisions now advanced. Therefore, the Army High Command of the 7th Army ordered the 84th Army Corps under von Koltitz to break through to the southeast to avoid encirclement. However, he initially resisted carrying out the order because he did not want to give up the west coast of the Cotentin Peninsula without a fight. Now, however, the Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, ordered a withdrawal to the south on July 28. This meant that, from the German side, the battle in the Normandy region was finally abandoned. On their way to Paris, central France, shown in green, now lay open to the Allied forces as if on a silver platter. On the 26th August, 2.5 months after the landing in Normandy, their units rolled into the open city of Paris, where, on June 14, 1940, the German victory parade had taken place on the Champs-Élysées. The victorious U.S. Army was now marching. In Normandy, numerous cemeteries serve as reminders of the heavy and costly battles for both sides. In the German military cemetery in Lacombe alone, 21,222 fallen soldiers from all branches of the Wehrmacht are buried. Their ages range from 16 to 72 years old.